I've got complaints. I've got reasonable suspicion. Open the bag.
I do not consent to a search. What crime do you suspect me of?
Refusing makes you look suspicious.
I'm doing laundry. I'm not required to consent.
I can put you in cuffs. You want that?
Do not touch my property. That's
Then
essential.
open it, now.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realized how dangerous ridiculous could get when it was backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Because Officer Mason Reed had his hand hovering near his belt like he was preparing for a threat that didn't exist, while insisting it absolutely did. He stood over an older man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved suddenly, hadn't done anything except refuse. Reed kept insisting he had complaints. He kept saying he had reasonable suspicion. He kept pushing for one thing, access. And when the older man calmly declined again, Reed switched tactics. He stopped pretending it was a request and started framing it like a choice between compliance and punishment. He made it clear he could put the man in cuffs. He made it clear he could take him downtown. He made it clear he could make the night messy on purpose. The older man didn't bargain. He didn't plead. He didn't perform fear. He simply held the line, politely, repeatedly, by invoking rights Reed was supposed to protect. And that raised one big question the entire time. If this was truly about safety, why was Reed acting like he needed permission to be angry? Now pause right here. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. City, state, country. And if you like stories where people stay calm under pressure, know their rights, and still force accountability without losing control, hit like and subscribe. Because this one is a textbook example of how power tries to win when it can't justify itself. All right, rewind. It started in a laundromat late at night, the kind of bright humming place that felt safe purely because it was lit up, not because it was protected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Machines rumbled in steady cycles. The air smelled like detergent and warm cotton. A security camera sat high above the change machine, blinking like a quiet witness that never slept. Judge Franklin Carter didn't look like a judge that night. That detail mattered more than anyone in the room understood at first. He wore plain clothes, no robe, no suit, nothing that signaled status. He moved like an older man who'd done the same routine 1,000 times, slow, careful, and not in a hurry to impress anybody. He carried a heavy duffel bag because it was practical. Clothes were easier to move that way. His reason for being there was simple and modern. His washer at home had broken in the most annoying way possible, leaving him with wet clothes, a minor flood, and a schedule that didn't care. He had a courthouse morning ahead of him. He preferred order. He preferred being prepared. So he went where people go when life does what life does. He found the nearest 24-hour laundromat and handled it himself. No drama, no scene, just laundry. Officer Mason Reed, though, wasn't walking into the laundromat looking for normal. Reed had been on shift for hours, the kind of shift where boredom mixed with ego and turned into a need to find something. A call had come in earlier, thin details, vague language. A so-called concerned person had described a suspicious male with a large bag. No crime reported, no clear threat described. Just that familiar label that could be stretched to cover almost anything. Suspicious. Reed chose to respond like it was a gift. He pulled up, walked in, and immediately scanned the room the way some officers did when they wanted to establish dominance before they ever spoke. One patron kept their head down, trying to disappear into their phone. Carter didn't react at all because he didn't need to. That non-reaction bothered Reed. So Reed approached and tried to control the story from the start. He treated Carter like someone who needed to explain himself. He kept circling back to the duffel bag's weight, the way it sat beside him, the way Carter kept a hand near it. Not because he was hiding something, but because it was his property. Reed didn't present facts. He presented implications. He implied fear. He implied danger. He implied that the bag had to contain something that justified the way Reed wanted to act. He pushed for answers about what was inside. He floated the usual scary categories, things that made people surrender quickly when they didn't want problems. Carter didn't take the bait. He responded in a way that sounded almost boring because it was disciplined. He explained he was doing laundry. He kept his hands visible. He didn't argue about Reed's job. He didn't insult him. He didn't escalate. He just refused consent. And Reed, hearing a calm no, did what a lot of people in power did when they expected automatic obedience. He tried to turn the refusal itself into suspicion. He invoked reasonable suspicion, like it was a magic phrase that could erase the Fourth Amendment. He leaned into the idea that complaints were enough. He tried the pressure sequence, step by step, first casual, then annoyed, then threatening. Carter stayed steady, but he also did something important. He made the record clean. He kept repeating that he did not consent to a search. He made it clear he understood the difference between a lawful order and an intimidation tactic. He challenged the logic without challenging Reed's ego directly. He forced Reed to either justify the search properly or admit it was just muscle. And there were eyes everywhere. The laundromat's security camera silent and high. Reed's body camera, if it was on like it should have been. And a patron who had stopped pretending to scroll and had started paying attention the way people do when they sense something crossing a line. That's when Reed stopped trying to win with words. He moved to win with hands. He reached towards the duffel bag. Carter warned him not to touch his property, calmly, clearly, because that wasn't just rude. It was a seizure. Reed didn't stop. And Carter, still controlled, decided to do the safest thing possible in the most unsafe moment. He said he would open the bag himself, slowly, because Reed's posture and hovering hand signaled the kind of hair-trigger mindset that turned normal movements into threats. The room tightened. The air felt smaller. Even the machine sounded louder, because Reed was about to find out what was inside. And Carter was about to reveal something else Reed never saw coming. Carter opened the duffel bag slowly. He did it on purpose. Reed was too close, watching his hands like he expected a problem. Carter kept his movements small, no fast reaches, no surprises. The kind of careful that says, "I'm not giving you an excuse." Inside were folded clothes, shirts, pants, socks, a towel, nothing else. Reed paused, just long enough for it to land. He'd walked in expecting to find something. Now he was standing over an older man with laundry in a bag. And the whole thing looked the way it really was. Bad. Reed tried to save it. He acted like the bag still proved something. He pushed the idea that Carter had been acting suspicious by holding it close. He made it sound like protecting your own property was a sign of guilt. Carter didn't argue. He didn't get loud. He kept it simple. He made it clear the bag was his. He didn't have to explain it, and he didn't have to consent to a search. That's when Reed's patience snapped. His voice tightened. His body language changed. The friendly act dropped. He started talking like Carter had forced this. Like refusing the search was the reason Reed was threatening cuffs. Like the officer's choices were Carter's fault. That was the real tell. Because if it was truly about safety, the close would have ended it. Instead, Reed was still trying to win. And the room wasn't private anymore. A security camera sat above the change machine, blinking. If Reed's body cam was on, it was rolling too. And a patron in the back had stopped pretending not to notice. Their attention was up. Their phone looked like it might be recording. Reed seemed to notice that shift. He tried to soften his tone. He started acting like he was ready to wrap it up. Like it had been a normal check. Carter let him talk. Then Carter asked Reed if he recognized him. Reed looked again. Really looked. Not like a cop scanning a suspicious person, like someone trying to place a face. His expression changed fast. Carter gave his name in a calm, flat way. No big reveal, no drama. Judge Franklin Carter. Reed's whole body language collapsed. His shoulders dropped. His hands opened. His voice went shaky. He started apologizing hard, like he could rewind the last 5 minutes with manners. Carter didn't let the apology erase anything. He laid it out clean. Reed had pushed a search with no warrant, used threats to pressure consent, and put hands on someone's property without legal grounds. Then Carter hit the point that mattered. Reed only cared once he realized who Carter was. That was the real problem, not a mix-up, not a misunderstanding. The fact that Reed's behavior depended on status. Reed tried to bargain. He tried to back out and make it disappear. He kept apologizing. He kept asking in a roundabout way for Carter not to take it further. Carter told him that wasn't Reed's call. He said he would decide what belonged on the docket, and he warned Reed that the next time he needed a warrant or he needed to walk away. Reed left fast. He suddenly remembered how to de-escalate. After the door shut, the laundromat didn't feel normal again. Carter zipped the bag, went back to folding, and looked up once at the security camera, like he was making sure the record existed. Because the next day wasn't going to be a late-night power trip. It was going to be a courtroom. Carter didn't chase Reed outside. He didn't lecture him in the parking lot. He didn't do any of that. He stayed inside, finished folding, and handled it the same way he handled everything else, like it would end up on paper. Before he left, he looked up at the security camera again. Not dramatic, just practical. He needed to know the place had coverage. Then he walked over to the counter and asked who owned the laundromat and how footage requests were handled. The employee didn't ask many questions. They didn't need to. The older man's tone made it clear this wasn't gossip. Carter asked for the manager's contact. He asked how long video was stored. He asked them not to overwrite anything from that night. He didn't demand. He documented. Then he turned to the one patron who had been watching. He didn't ask them to take sides. He asked them for a name and number, in case someone later needed a witness statement. The patron hesitated, then gave it. People got nervous when police were involved, but they got more nervous when they realized the police could do that to anyone. Carter went home and wrote down the timeline while it was fresh. Times, location, what Reed did, what Reed threatened, what Reed touched, what cameras were present. He didn't write it like a speech. He wrote it like a record. Then he made 2 calls. One was to the court administrator's office to flag a potential conflict for the next morning. The other was to a contact at the department who handled complaints and evidence preservation requests. Carter didn't try to play detective. He requested that the body cam footage be preserved. He requested that any dispatch audio tied to the complaints call be preserved too, because he already knew how this worked. If nobody locked the evidence down early, it disappeared later. Not always on purpose. Sometimes just because systems were lazy. Either way, the result was the same. By the time Carter went to bed, he wasn't thinking about the duffel bag anymore. He was thinking about the part that bothered him most. Reed hadn't stopped because the bag was harmless. Reed stopped because Carter was important. That was the line that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Carter went to the courthouse early. Same calm, same routine, but his staff noticed the difference right away. He wasn't rushed, but he was focused. He did the first thing judges did when something could compromise a case. He made sure it was handled on the record, not in the hallway. Officer Mason Reed had a court matter tied to the FOP. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines, more internal than public. The sort of issue where officers and their union fought about discipline, procedure, or a past incident. The kind of case where a judge's neutrality mattered a lot. And now Reed had personally stepped into Carter's life the night before. That wasn't something Carter could pretend away. When court started, Reed walked in looking like he hadn't slept. He wasn't acting tough now. He kept his eyes down. He stood stiff. His face had that tight look people got when they knew they'd messed up, but they were hoping nobody else knew. But Carter wasn't playing gotcha. He handled it clean. He disclosed that there had been an interaction the night before involving Reed and a possible rights violation. He stated that it created at least the appearance of a conflict. He said the matter would be reassigned to another judge to keep the process fair. That move hit like a hammer because it did two things at once. It removed any argument that Carter was retaliating through the FOP case, and it made it clear the laundromat incident wasn't going to vanish. Reed's side looked relieved for half a second, until they realized reassignment didn't mean forgiveness. It meant separation. Carter also stated that the incident itself was being referred through proper channels for review, not handled through courtroom attitude, not handled through whispers, through oversight. After that, it moved fast. Internal Affairs opened a file. Not because Carter was a judge, because the facts were ugly on their own. The dispatch record mattered. If Reed truly had complaints, there would be a log. There would be a call type. There would be a reporting party, or at least a timestamp. If the call was thin, that mattered too. Then the footage. Bodycam footage showed tone. It showed distance. It showed whether Reed threatened cuffs before he had legal grounds. It showed whether Reed used reasonable suspicion as a reason or as a cover. And the laundromat camera did something body cams sometimes didn't. It showed the whole room. It showed whether Carter had been calm. It showed whether Reed crowded him. It showed Reed reaching for the bag. It also showed the patron in the back. The human reaction. The moment the room realized this was going sideways. Within days, Reed's supervisors called him in. Union representation sat beside him. The normal script started. He was responding to a call. He was checking for safety. He was doing his job. But the problem with video was that it didn't care about scripts. And the problem with threats was that they sounded like threats no matter how you explain them later. Carter didn't do interviews. He didn't post about it. He didn't go looking for attention. He did what he'd always done in court. He let documentation speak. He filed a formal complaint. He included times, location, and a plain summary. He requested the evidence be preserved and reviewed. He also noted something that mattered a lot in these cases. Reed escalated after Carter refused consent. That detail was key, because consent was voluntary, and threats weren't voluntary. Reed's department put him on a short leash while the review ran. Depending on policy, it could mean modified duty. It could mean retraining. It could mean suspension. The point wasn't instant karma. The point was process. And Carter kept coming back to the same idea when people asked him privately why he pushed it. If Reed did that to an older man in a laundromat, he did it to people who had no title, no courthouse, and no staff to help preserve evidence. That was the real reason it mattered. The review moved faster than usual. And it wasn't because Carter was a judge. It was because the evidence was clear. Investigators pulled two things first: the dispatch record for the complaints and the video. If Reed really had a solid call, it would show up in the log with details. And if it was thin and vague, that showed too. Then they watched footage. The laundromat camera showed the whole room. Reed crowding Carter, reaching for the bag, and the way the place got quiet when the tone turned. Reed's body cam showed the order of events, how he pushed for a search, how Carter refused consent, and how Reed escalated after the refusal. That detail hurt Reed the most, because refusal isn't a crime. And it isn't reasonable suspicion. It's just a no. Reed's report tried to lean on phrases like officer safety and reasonable suspicion, but the video showed what actually happened. Pressure for consent, threats about cuffs and downtown, and hands on someone's property without legal grounds. So the department handled it through policy, not headlines, not drama. Reed got pulled off regular patrol while it was reviewed. Discipline followed, some mix of suspension, retraining, and a sustained finding depending on his record. If there were gaps in his body cam activation, that became part of it too. The union pushed back like unions do, but video made it hard to spin. And the ripple effect hit the precinct. Supervisors got stricter about body cams, consent searches, and stops based on vague complaints. Not because everyone suddenly changed, because everyone saw how exposed Reed got when a stop couldn't be justified on the record. A few weeks after the laundromat, Officer Mason Reed wasn't walking into places the same way. The discipline stuck, not as some dramatic downfall, but as a real mark inside the department. Supervisors watched him closer. Paperwork got checked harder. Any stop that relied on vague feelings became a risk he couldn't afford. He also lost something that mattered more than days off or training. He lost trust because the footage showed a pattern that didn't look like safety. It looked like pressure. And once that's on record, people remember. Judge Franklin Carter didn't go public with it. No interviews, no attention. He treated it like he treated cases. Document, preserve, follow process. But privately, he didn't let the main point get buried. Reed didn't change because the bag had laundry. Reed changed because the man with the bag had a title. That meant Reed's behavior wasn't about facts. It was about who he thought he could push. Carter pushed the system in the only way that actually lasts. He made sure evidence got preserved. He made sure the complaint stayed clean and specific. And he pushed for tighter expectations around consent, searches, and complaint calls that came in with no real details. The laundromat patron who watched that night ended up mattering too, not as a hero, just as a witness who helped keep the story honest when it could have been rewritten later. And that's the lesson that sat underneath everything. Rights don't protect you by themselves. Calm does, clarity does, records do. So, what would you have done in that laundromat? Would you have known how to refuse without escalating the situation? Tell me in the comments and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that no is allowed. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on dignity and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
That patient matches my bolo. I'm taking him downtown. I don't need a warrant.
Lower your voice and step out. You have no legal basis to interfere with medical care.
You protecting your homeboy? You want to be treated like an
You
accessory?
don't have authority here without paperwork.
Step aside or you're getting obstruction.
I'm federal, and this patient is tied.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And here's the part that still sticks. It wasn't one big dramatic moment that decided how it ended. It was one tiny detail, one sentence, one piece of information that changed the entire power dynamic in real time. Because let me ask you this. What do you do when someone shows up acting like the rules don't apply to them, and everyone around you is too exhausted, too busy, or too intimidated to push back? What if you're the only person standing between official and out of control? Quick check-in. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you're into stories where intimidation fails the second it runs into somebody calm, prepared, and unmovable, hit like and subscribe. This one is a perfect example of how power bluffs and what happens when the bluff gets recorded. Now, here's where it actually happened. It was a hospital, late evening. The kind of place where the lights were always too bright and the hallways always sounded too quiet until they didn't. A treatment room door swung open hard enough to rattle the latch, and Officer Caleb Raines came in like he was responding to a crime in progress. He didn't come in with questions. He came in with conclusions. He announced that a John Doe patient inside matched his bolo. He insisted he didn't need a warrant to take the patient downtown. He spoke over the room like volume could substitute for paperwork. And right in the doorway line, blocking him without touching him, was Evan Cole. Evan looked like someone who had no business standing up. Fresh stitches, bandage pressure under his shirt, a hospital wristband half twisted on his arm. His posture was controlled, but the slow way he shifted his weight gave away the pain. Raines tried to treat that pain like leverage. Evan didn't give him any. Evan told Raines to lower his voice and leave the room, explaining that he had no legal basis to be there and no authority to interfere with medical care. Evan didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a boundary. Rains responded like boundaries were disrespect. He accused Evan of protecting a homeboy. Not subtly, not accidentally. He implied Evan was part of the reason the patient was there. He warned Evan that he could be treated like an accessory. Then Rains threatened an obstruction arrest if Evan didn't step aside. That's how the chess game started. Not with facts, but with labels. He tried to make Evan defend his character instead of enforcing the rules. He tried to turn the room into a street stop where the loudest voice controlled the pace. Evan didn't defend himself. He didn't argue about insults. He stayed on process. Rains shifted tactics again. He demanded Evan's ID and said he would haul him downtown to run his entire background. He framed it like a consequence Evan had earned, not a legal step that required justification. In that moment, the threat wasn't really about ID. It was about humiliation, control, the message that a badge could turn inconvenience into punishment. Evan refused, not theatrically, not with anger, just a flat, steady refusal that forced Rains to do the one thing he hated most: slow down. A charge nurse stepped in next, Marisol Vega, experienced enough to recognize exactly what this was. She told Rains he couldn't enter a treatment room like that, and that if he had proper paperwork, it needed to go through administration. Rains dismissed her and kept pressing forward, repeating that the BOLO gave him full jurisdiction. A doctor reinforced it after that, telling him the patient was under active care and not cleared for anything Rains was demanding. The message was simple. Treatment came first. Rains treated treatment like an inconvenience. His focus stayed locked on one goal: access. And while he kept saying John Doe, he let something slip, something small but fatal to his own story. He admitted he actually knew the suspect's real identity. He tried to glide past it like it didn't matter. Like calling the patient John Doe was just a harmless label. But it mattered. Because if he knew who he was looking for, then John Doe wasn't uncertainty. It was a strategy, a way to force the situation without admitting he was targeting a specific person, without the legal steps that would normally be required. Evan caught it immediately and pointed out the contradiction, keeping it clinical and calm. Rains tried to shut that down by escalating again, repeating the BOLO line, leaning harder into authority theater. Evan shifted from holding the doorway to building a record. He instructed the nurse to call hospital security and hospital legal. Rains mocked it, because mockery is what people reach for when they feel the room slipping away. Then he made the mistake that hospitals never ignore. He moved closer, using physical presence to pressure compliance without saying it outright. Evan warned him not to touch him, and Evan reminded him that the hospital was covered in cameras, that hallways logged movement, and that staff documented incidents. The hospital wasn't a place where things disappeared into he said, she said. It was a place that produced timestamps. That tiny detail tightened the trap. Rains tried to reassert control by implying Evan wasn't in charge, and Evan didn't argue that point. Instead, Evan revealed the one thing that made Rains' entire approach instantly dangerous for him. Evan made it clear he was federal. And then he made it clear the John Doe patient was connected to an ongoing federal RICO case. The room didn't get louder after that. It got quiet in the specific way people go quiet when they realize a line has been crossed on camera. Evan told Rains that simply being in the room and attempting to take the patient was a jurisdictional violation, and Evan ordered him to leave immediately. Rains froze, recalculating, because the intimidation that had looked like authority when he walked in now looked like a career-ending mistake. Rains stood there for a beat too long, like his brain was trying to decide whether it had just heard a bluff or a name that could end his job. His posture changed first. The shoulders that had been squared for dominance loosened. The chin that had been tilted up dropped slightly. His eyes stopped scanning the room for leverage and started scanning it for exits. Cameras, staff, the hallway, the nurse station, anyone who might have heard the last 30 seconds. Evan didn't move aside. He didn't advance either. He stayed exactly where he was, steady, controlled, forcing the officer to do something rare, make a decision without momentum. So Rains tried to rebuild his authority in the only way he knew how, by reframing. He acted as if the federal angle was irrelevant. He tried to treat it like a misunderstanding that could be fixed by him simply insisting he was still in charge. He implied he could coordinate if Evan just stepped aside. But the room wasn't negotiating anymore. Nurse Vega had already started the documentation chain. Timestamps, names, a brief description of behavior, and the reason the hospital considered it an intrusion. Hospitals were built for records. A chart existed for everything. An incident report existed for anything out of pattern. This wasn't going to stay a hallway rumor. Dr. Shaw didn't debate the investigation. She made it purely medical. The patient wasn't cleared, and the officer was obstructing care by being there, raising his voice, and creating disruption. That framing mattered because it stripped away the officer's favorite cover story. He couldn't claim he was just doing his job when the job was actively interfering with treatment. Then the physical boundary arrived. Security lead Darnell Briggs came in with 2 officers, not rushing, not dramatic, just present. Hospital security didn't act like police. They didn't need to. Their authority came from policy, property, and documentation. Briggs positioned himself in the doorway line with Evan, slightly offset so the officer couldn't claim he was being blocked by a patient alone. That mattered too. It turned the scene from a personal confrontation into a procedural response. Rains tried to talk past security. He tried to keep the focus on the patient behind the curtain. He repeated the bolo point again, as if repeating it could retroactively make it valid. Briggs didn't argue. He requested the warrant, the supervisor contact, or a written directive. When Rains couldn't provide any of it, Briggs did what systems do when a bluff is exposed. He narrowed the options. The officer could step out voluntarily, or he could be escorted out and documented as refusing to comply with hospital policy in a treatment area. That second option would have been ugly, not physically, paperwork ugly. The kind of ugly that follows a person. Rains looked at Evan again, searching for the crack he'd missed, the angle he could exploit, the fear he could trigger. Evan gave him nothing. Evan kept it short and controlled, making it clear that Rains remaining in that room was no longer a disagreement. It was an interference issue. That's when Rains made the first move that looked like damage control. He backed up half a step and reached for his radio. But even that wasn't clean. It was the kind of radio use designed for theater, loud enough to signal power, vague enough to avoid accountability. He tried to phrase it like he was checking in, rather than admitting he had just been told to leave a room he had stormed into. Evan watched the officer's hands more than his face. Because in real life, the dangerous part isn't always what someone says. It's what they do when they realize they've lost control. Rains didn't get what he wanted on the radio. Either supervisor didn't answer fast enough or the answer wasn't what he expected. His face tightened as he listened. The performance started to crack. The officer who had entered the room like a storm now had to stand there and receive information like a subordinate. That was the second tiny detail that changed the outcome. Rains wasn't alone in his chain of command anymore. And the chain didn't like surprises. He lowered the radio and tried to salvage it verbally, implying that he could leave for now and return with proper authority. He framed it like a professional step, not a retreat. Briggs didn't care what he called it. Security escorted him out of the room and into the hallway. Once Rains was out, the room exhaled. It didn't turn into celebration. Hospitals don't celebrate. They stabilize and move on. Dr. Shaw returned to treatment. Nurse Vega checked vitals and updated the chart. A tech adjusted an IV line. The monitors kept beeping like they always had. But the emotional temperature had changed. Because everybody in that room understood what almost happened. A patient under care could have been pulled into the criminal justice system on a bolo in a loud voice, with no warrant, no clearance, and no respect for medical priority. And if Evan hadn't been the type of person who could say one sentence that forced a recalculation, that patient would have been gone. Evan sat back down carefully, as if his body finally remembered it had limits. His face stayed controlled, but the tension in his jaw didn't fully release. The pain wasn't just from the wound. It was from how close the system had come to doing what it often does when nobody pushes back. Outside the room, the consequences started moving almost immediately. A supervisor showed up within the hour, but not with the confidence Rains had walked in with. This was a different energy, measured, cautious, aware of optics. The supervisor spoke with hospital administration. He asked for the incident report. He asked for the camera coverage. He asked who exactly had been in the room. And that right there was the third tiny detail. Because in departments that care about liability, the question isn't always what happened. The question is what was recorded. Body camera footage existed. Hospital hallway cameras existed. Security logs existed. Nursing documentation existed. Names and times existed. Rains couldn't outrun that. By the next morning, the hospital's legal team had already packaged the complaint into something departments recognized: an allegation of improper access, interference with care, and threatening behavior towards staff and a patient. It didn't read like drama. It read like liability. And when liability shows up, the "we'll handle it internally" tone disappears fast. Meanwhile, Evan's side of the world moved differently, quieter but heavier. Evan didn't make loud calls in the hallway. He didn't announce federal names. He didn't need to. He communicated upward through the channels that mattered, and those channels treated what happened as more than a bad interaction. Because from a federal perspective, it wasn't just rudeness. It was potential interference. A local officer had attempted to seize an individual connected to a federal investigation in a protected environment, without coordination, and with threats directed at someone who told him to stop. So the response on the federal side wasn't emotional, it was procedural. The kind of procedure that shows up as letters, calls between offices, and careful language that sounds polite while it tightens the walls around the person who messed up. Rains felt it before he fully understood it. He got pulled off the street for administrative reasons. That phrase always sounded neutral until it happened to you. He was told to write a statement. He was told not to discuss the incident. He was told to surrender any relevant footage for review. And the worst part for him was that nobody acted like this was a misunderstanding. They acted like it was evidence. By the end of that day, Internal Affairs had opened a preliminary review. Not a friendly conversation, not a coaching moment. A review? Because when a hospital files a complaint, staff are witnesses. Security is a witness. Cameras are witnesses. Records are witnesses. And Evan was the one witness Rains couldn't intimidate. Rains sat in a small room later. No flashing lights, no sirens, no adrenaline. Just forms, policy language, and a supervisor across the table asking him to explain, step by step, why he thought a bolo gave him full jurisdiction inside a hospital room. And for the first time, he didn't have volume. He had to have answers. Internal Affairs didn't treat it like a personality conflict. They treated it like an exposure event. The first thing they did was lock down the timeline. When Rains arrived, who let him past the desk, which hallway cameras caught him moving toward the treatment wing, and how long he stayed inside the room after being told to leave by medical staff. Then they pulled the recordings. His body cam mattered, but it wasn't the only record. The hospital's security cameras showed the entrance angle, the hallway approach, the doorway traffic, and the moment security arrived. Nurse Vega's incident report read like a checklist. Raised voice in a treatment area, refusal to follow access protocol, pressure tactics toward staff, threats toward a patient, and repeated attempts to bypass medical clearance. And the part that made supervisors go quiet wasn't even the volume. It was the contradiction. On camera, Rains had leaned on the John Doe label, as if it gave him flexibility. But he also revealed he knew the suspect's real identity. That wasn't a slip you could wording your way out of. It meant he hadn't walked into that room confused. He walked in committed to forcing access without the steps that create accountability. That detail mattered for another reason, too. It shredded the department's usual defense. They couldn't claim he was acting under urgent uncertainty. The record showed he was acting under urgent impatience. The hospital's legal team didn't frame it like a dramatic complaint. They framed it like liability. They sent a formal notice that a sworn officer entered a restricted treatment space without proper authorization, attempted to remove a patient under active care without a warrant, and threatened staff and a patient when challenged. They attached camera stills, timestamps, and the names of witnesses willing to testify. That package landed on the department like a weight, because hospitals don't bluff. They document. Meanwhile, the federal side didn't yell either. They did something worse for Rains. They made it official. A federal supervisor contacted the department's command staff and made clear that the John Doe patient was tied to an active federal operation, and that the attempted removal created a real risk to an ongoing RICO case. The message wasn't emotional, it was procedural. It emphasized interagency boundaries and the consequences of interference. And that's when the entire situation stopped being a local embarrassment and became a command-level problem. Rains got pulled off patrol pending review. He sat through an interview where he tried to reframe his actions as proactive policing. He tried to make the bolo sound like permission. He tried to describe the threats as normal control of a scene. But the people across from him didn't need his story anymore. They had video. IA didn't have to guess tone. They could hear it. They didn't have to infer intent. They could watch him push past medical staff, push past policy, push past clear boundaries, and keep going until the room's power dynamic changed. And that change, Evan's quiet reveal, was the moment the officer's posture shifted on camera. It was visible. It was undeniable. Within weeks, the outcome wasn't subtle. Rains was formally disciplined for unauthorized entry into a restricted treatment area, conduct unbecoming, and failure to follow interagency and departmental procedures. He was suspended and reassigned, barred from solo response to certain calls, and ordered into retraining focused on constitutional policing and medical facility protocol. The department also did something it hadn't planned to do before the cameras existed. It revised policy. A written directive went out clarifying that BOLOs did not authorize warrantless entry into treatment rooms, that hospital staff retained control of patient access absent proper legal process, and that officers needed supervisor approval and coordination before attempting any removal from medical care. The hospital, for its part, tightened its own system. Not because staff had been wrong, but because they understood how quickly loud authority could try to turn policy into a suggestion. They added signage in the treatment wing. They updated the checklist at the security desk. They trained nurses on exactly what to say and exactly who to call when someone tried to muscle their way in. They built a faster path to legal counsel for law enforcement conflicts. And Evan went back to being what he had been before the door swung open, controlled, quiet, prepared. He didn't take victory laps. People like him couldn't afford to. He understood that being right didn't always make you safe. It just gave you a chance. The John Doe patient remained where he needed to be until he was properly cleared. The federal case moved forward without a local officer contaminating the timeline. And the hospital staff, especially Nurse Vega and Dr. Shaw, kept doing what they always did, showing up, holding the line, and documenting the truth. What this story showed, in the simplest terms, was that power loves confusion. It loves loud certainty. It loves people who don't know procedure well enough to challenge it. But the second someone stays calm, stays precise, and turns the moment into a record, the bluff collapses. So here's the question for you. If you were in that room, tired, stressed, just trying to do your job, would you have pushed back? Or would you have stepped aside and hoped it wasn't your problem? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share this with someone who needs the reminder that a badge is not a blank check. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and built around accountability, make sure you subscribe.
Sir, you need to back your scooter away from the pharmacy counter. Stop yelling at staff and customers.
I'm a Navy veteran. Look at my. This is how you treat a disabled man?
Lower your voice.
You're all against me. I'm not going anywhere.
Spit on me.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This was one of those situations that sounded almost ridiculous, until it became obvious how dangerous ridiculous gets when it's backed by entitlement, happening in public, and the only people who can shut it down are forced to document every move. And the scariest part? One tiny escalation turned this from a simple removal into a case that ended with cuffs, charges, and a hospital stop before jail would even accept him. When officers reached the pharmacy area inside the Target in Clark County, Georgia, Hank Blair Wittenberg was already in full display mode on his mobility scooter. Officer Marcus Young immediately tried to control the scene and get Hank identified and removed. Hank refused to cooperate and kept escalating in front of shoppers. Officer Elena Ramirez positioned herself close enough to intervene because Hank's behavior wasn't just loud. It was volatile, racial, and aimed at staff and customers who couldn't just walk away. Tell me where you're watching from, city, state, or country. And if you like stories where hateful behavior meets real consequences through cameras, procedure, and accountability, hit like and subscribe. These are the kind of moments that only change when people stop letting them slide. Now, rewind. Earlier, the pharmacy team had been trying to keep the day normal. Tanya Brooks was behind the counter doing what pharmacy staff always did, moving fast, answering questions, trying to keep the line from backing up. That routine broke when Hank parked himself near the pharmacy and started going after people. It wasn't a complaint about service. It wasn't confusion. It was harassment, loud, repeated, and racially abusive. Customers reacted the way people often did in stores. They avoided eye contact and tried to move past it like it wasn't happening. But the noise followed them. A few shoppers slowed down to watch. Others sped up. Jamal Price was one of the people who couldn't just tune it out because he had kids with him. And now he had to manage a family moment while an adult man was yelling hateful things a few aisles away. At first, the store tried to handle it in-house. Derek Holloway, the on-duty manager, came over to assess and contain it. He wasn't looking for drama. He was looking for an exit route, get Hank away from the pharmacy, stop the disruption, and prevent the situation from spreading into the rest of the store. But Hank didn't take any off-ramp. He stayed combative. He stayed loud. He stayed racial. And every time staff tried to set a boundary, he responded by escalating again, like the attention was the point. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't just rude. It was unstable behavior in a crowded public space, where nobody knew what he'd do next. So Derek made the call that turns a retail problem into a legal one. Police were contacted. When Officer Marcus Young and Officer Elena Ramirez arrived, Hank tried to take control of the interaction immediately. He attempted to redirect the focus away from what he'd been doing and toward himself, specifically a severe toe-foot injury and his Navy veteran status. Like those facts should override the reason officers were there. The officers didn't ignore the injury, but they didn't let it become a shield either. Officer Young kept the purpose clear. Hank's behavior near the pharmacy had created a disturbance and targeted people in a way the store couldn't manage safely. Hank's response was to double down. He refused to cooperate. He stayed combative. He continued escalating while shoppers watched, some frozen, some whispering, some trying to pretend it wasn't happening. And in moments like this, the crowd matters. Because every extra second the behavior continues, more people get pulled in, and the store becomes less safe. By the end of this phase, the situation had shifted. It stopped being about simply removing Hank from the store. It became about whether officers could end the disturbance without Hank forcing it into something worse, right there in front of staff, families, and cameras. And Hank looked like he was about to test that limit. Hank Blair Wittenberg kept pushing like the officers were there to negotiate with him instead of stop him. Officer Marcus Young stayed focused on clearing the pharmacy area and restoring order. He kept the instructions simple and procedural. Move away from the counter, stop yelling at staff and customers, and cooperate so this could end without anyone getting hurt or dragged into it. Officer Elena Ramirez held her position close enough to step in, but not so close she'd create a new excuse for Hank to claim he was being crowded. She watched his hands, his face, and the way he kept turning his scooter slightly to keep an audience. Hank used every second to perform. He kept redirecting back to his toe-foot injury and his Navy veteran status, like those 2 points should erase what everyone had just witnessed. But the louder he got, the less that redirect worked. Shoppers weren't reacting like this was a misunderstanding. They were reacting like this was a grown man choosing to terrorize a public space. Tanya Brooks stayed behind the counter, trying to keep her hands steady as she did her job. Derek Holloway hovered nearby, ready to issue the store's next step if police needed it documented. Jamal Price stayed with his kids, now fully locked into protective parent mode, scanning for a clean path out. Officer Young attempted one last off-ramp: cooperate, get out of the store, and let this end as a removal instead of an arrest. Hank refused, and not in a quiet way. He escalated louder, angrier, and more racially abusive, still using slurs and insults aimed at staff and bystanders, like he wanted someone to react so he could turn the narrative. That was when the situation tipped. In the middle of the confrontation, Hank spit into Officer Elena Ramirez's face. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a stray droplet in the chaos. It was a deliberate act that crossed a line every officer understood. The moment that turned the call from disturbance into battery. The change in the officers was immediate. The conversation ended. The control phase began. Officer Young moved in with Officer Ramirez, and they placed Hank in handcuffs. The officers didn't debate it because there was nothing left to debate. The spit made the decision for everyone. It also made the paperwork clear. That one action gave officers what they needed to justify custody without needing to stretch the original call into something it wasn't. Hank reacted the way people often did when they realized they'd overplayed their hand. He got louder. He kept shouting insults and racial abuse, only now it wasn't directed at helpless staff. It was aimed at the officers and anyone nearby who looked like they might be listening. The pharmacy area felt tense and exposed, like the whole store had been forced into the moment. Because Hank had already shown he'd spit once, Officer Young and Officer Ramirez applied a spit hood to prevent it from happening again. It was a safety measure, not drama. It was the officers acknowledging reality. The man had already crossed a bodily boundary, and they weren't going to let him do it twice. While police handled custody, Derek Holloway handled Target's side of the consequences. He formally barred Hank from the store for roughly 2 years. Not as a symbolic punishment, an actual trespass barman action that meant Hank could be arrested if he returned. It was the store drawing a line in ink, not just in conversation. Hank didn't calm down once he was secured. During transport, he continued a long stream of insults and racist comments. Officer Young documented it, while keeping the drive controlled and the situation contained. Officer Ramirez stayed alert, absorbing what had already happened, and making sure the process stayed clean. There was no room for shortcuts now. Everything had to be done by the book, because a case like this always tried to twist itself into a complaint later. At one point in the transport, Officer Young referenced what the store already knew. Hank wasn't a one-time surprise. He had been a repeat call at that Target. Staff had dealt with him before. The difference this time was that the behavior had escalated in front of more witnesses in a tighter space, and then crossed into a clear criminal act. By the time they reached booking, the incident had already turned into a folder. Disturbance, racial harassment, a public audience, the spit, the restraint, the hood, and the official barment. Every step had a reason attached to it. And that's where Hank ran into the consequence he wasn't expecting. Because even though officers were ready to book him on disorderly conduct and battery, the process didn't go straight into a cell. His foot wound, the same thing he tried to use as a shield earlier, suddenly mattered in a way that didn't help him at all. Intake took one look and refused to accept him without medical clearance, which meant the next stop wasn't a jail pod. It was a hospital. The moment they got to intake, the plan was straightforward. Book Hank Blair Wittenberg on disorderly conduct and battery for spitting on Officer Elena Ramirez, then let the jail handle him from there. But the jail didn't take him. Not yet. The intake staff saw the foot situation up close, whatever Hank had been pointing to earlier as a severe toe-foot injury. And they did what jails often did when someone arrived with a visible medical issue. They refused acceptance until he was medically cleared. It wasn't about sympathy. It was liability. If they took him in and something went wrong, it became their problem. So instead of Hank disappearing into a holding cell like he'd probably assumed would happen to other people, the process hit a hard stop. Officer Marcus Young had to pivot. The paperwork didn't end. The custody didn't end. It just moved locations. They transported Hank to a hospital. And here's what's important about that hospital detour. Hospitals create documentation outside police control. Timestamps, notes, observations, a separate chain of records that can't be rewritten later to make a story cleaner. At the hospital, Hank tried to reclaim the narrative again. Injury first, veteran status next, outrage on top. But it didn't work the way he wanted because the setting changed the rules. In Target, he'd been able to use volume and public pressure. In a hospital, nobody cared how loud he was. They cared about vitals, clearance, and whether he was fit to be held. Nurse Kelsey Nguyen handled the intake like she'd seen every version of this before. A patient in custody who wanted the whole room to revolve around them. She focused on the foot, assessed what needed to be assessed, and documented what needed to be documented. Meanwhile, Officer Young kept everything procedural. He maintained custody, tracked times, and ensured the chain stayed intact. Officer Ramirez, after being the target of the spit, stayed locked into the same thing she'd been doing from the start, keeping the case clean. No shortcuts, no extra friction, just documentation. Once medical clearance was obtained, they went back to complete what had been delayed. The jail accepted Hank after clearance, and that's when the charges became real, in the way people like Hank rarely expected them to. Not as a lecture, not as a scolding, but as a recorded, processed, official consequence. Disorderly conduct for the disturbance. Battery for spitting on a police officer. The spit hood, the trespass barment, the body-worn cameras, the store witnesses, the pharmacy staff, the transport documentation, the hospital clearance records, all of it formed a neat chain. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just tight. And that's the part that matters. Because in a lot of incidents like this, the person causing harm tries to rewrite the story afterward. They claim they were provoked. They claim they were targeted. They claim the public only saw a clip. But this wasn't a clip situation. This was a full sequence with multiple cameras, multiple witnesses, and multiple institutions logging the same reality. Target did its part through Derek Holloway's formal barment. The store drew a bright line. Hank wasn't welcome back for roughly 2 years, and returning could lead to another arrest. Tanya Brooks and the pharmacy staff had what they needed too, an official record that what happened to them wasn't just part of the job. And for the community, it served as a clear example of how accountability actually works when it's done right. Not through screaming matches, not through viral fantasies, through procedure. So here's the question for you. If you were in that Target, maybe with your kids like Jamal Price, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, filmed, walked away, grabbed a manager? And if you were the employee behind that pharmacy counter, how safe would you feel if nobody intervened? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that public racism isn't free speech when it becomes harassment and assault. And make sure you subscribe for more story times where the truth gets documented and consequences actually land.
What's up, my man? You've been here a minute. Go ahead, show me your ID.
I hear you, officer. I'm not providing ID. There is no reason for that.
We got a call. You've been sitting here too long.
Sitting in a diner isn't illegal. If you want me to leave, I'll leave.
No, you're not leaving until we know who you are.
I'm standing up and walking out.
Cuff him. Got it.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. Now, this was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous until it became clear how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't been in place, this would have ended a very different way. So picture this. Antonio Smith sat alone in a booth at a neighborhood diner that looked like it came straight out of a postcard. Clean windows, soft chatter, silverware clinking. The kind of place where people acted like nothing bad ever happened, because nothing bad ever happened to them. And yet 2 uniformed officers stood over him like he'd tripped an alarm. Officer Ryan Keller took the lead. Officer Johnny Briggs hovered just half a step behind, angled like he was ready to move, if Antonio so much as blinked wrong. Keller started with that practiced, casual energy. He talked to Antonio like they were already cool, like this was going to be quick, light, friendly. But the friendliness didn't last long. His voice shifted into something tighter, more official, more ownership. He told Antonio they'd gotten a call. Someone said Antonio had been sitting there, just hanging out for over an hour. Keller corrected himself and said closer to 90 minutes. Then he framed it like it wasn't really a question anymore. He said they couldn't be having that in this community. And right after that, Keller did what officers always did when they wanted the moment to tilt in their favor. He demanded ID, not asked. Demanded. He told Antonio to hand it over slowly, specifically to Briggs. He layered it with the usual warning about no quick movements. Like a man sitting in a booth deciding between breakfast and lunch had suddenly become a threat that needed careful handling. Antonio didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff his chest. He didn't perform anger for them to justify anything with. He stayed calm and polite and said he wasn't going to pull out his ID. And that one sentence changed everything. Keller treated the refusal like it automatically created a bigger issue, like declining to help them build a case was the same as committing a crime. He started talking about how this could turn into something else, how it could turn into charges, how they were going to identify Antonio one way or another. Briggs stayed quiet, but he leaned in just a little more, like Keller was winding up the words and Briggs was the tool that would finish the job. Antonio didn't argue the law in big speeches. He didn't insult them. He repeated himself calmly. He understood what Keller was saying. He was still not handing over ID. That was the moment where the whole diner felt like it held its breath. You know that feeling when normal life is still happening around you, but the air at your table is different? People kept eating. A server kept walking plates to tables. But a few heads turned and a few eyes lingered too long, like they were trying to figure out what Antonio had done to deserve this. Now, before we go further, drop where you're watching from. City, state, country, whatever. And if you like stories where people stay calm, under pressure, and still win through accountability, hit like and subscribe. Because this one is exactly about that. Staying steady while someone tries to bait you into being the problem. All right, back to it. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to rewind about an hour and a half. Antonio had walked into that diner like any other customer. No scene, no attitude. He'd picked a booth where he could see the door, the counter, and most of the room without turning his head too much. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was just intentional. He'd been calm, polite with staff, the type who said thank you like he meant it. And the thing is, diners like that loved calm customers. The regulars treated it like their living room. People sat longer than they ate. Folks camped out with coffee, refills, and laptops. Nobody called the police on that. But Antonio's black in a diner where community comfort was treated like a private club. At first, it was subtle, A long look from a man at the counter, a server hesitating a second longer than necessary, a woman glancing over and then quickly back to her phone, like she didn't want to be caught watching. Antonio didn't react. He didn't offer anyone a reason to escalate. He just sat, thinking, and flipping through food options like it was the most normal thing in the world. And in a way, that was the point. When Keller said he'd been there 90 minutes, Antonio didn't deny it. He didn't scramble to explain. He didn't start bargaining to make them comfortable. He just stayed calm and let the facts sit there. Keller kept building the story anyway. He claimed people were getting irritated. He implied Antonio wasn't ordering. He implied Antonio was there to bother people. Then he tried to end it with a simple command. Antonio needed to leave. But Antonio didn't move. He didn't stiffen up either. That's what made it so unsettling for them. He kept his tone even. He made it clear he heard Keller. He made it clear he understood the demand. And then, almost like he was speaking around them instead of to them, Antonio started talking about food. Not as a joke, not as sarcasm loud enough for the diner to laugh, just casually. Like he was deciding what sounded good. Avocado toast, beef stroganoff, grilled salmon. Things that had nothing to do with two officers looming over a booth. And you could feel Keller's patience thinning. He wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. He wasn't getting fear. He wasn't getting anger. He wasn't getting compliance. So Keller tightened the leash with words. He warned Antonio again that they were going to identify him one way or another. He brought up taking him downtown. He framed it like Antonio was choosing the hard way, like Antonio was the one escalating by not cooperating. Antonio didn't flinch. He stayed composed and repeated calmly that he wasn't handing over his ID. At that point, Briggs shifted his weight. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal he was ready for the next step. Keller watched Antonio for a beat, eyes hard now, the casual mask fully gone. And then Keller made the decision that turned a ridiculous situation into a dangerous one. He stopped trying to persuade. He switched to command, and Briggs moved closer, like he'd been waiting for that exact signal the whole time. Briggs stepped in tighter, and the space around Antonio's booth shrank fast. Keller's voice stayed controlled, but the message got uglier. He kept framing it like Antonio was the one creating a problem, like refusing to participate in their little script automatically meant guilt. Keller repeated that it was simple right now, just a guy hanging around too long. But if Antonio kept refusing, Keller implied they could turn it into something bigger, not because of anything Antonio had done, because they had the power to make it bigger. This was the chess move. Create a vague community complaint, turn it into suspicion, turn suspicion into demands, turn refusal into defiance, turn defiance into an excuse. Briggs stayed positioned like the consequence. He didn't have to say much. His silence did the job. It signaled that if Keller decided the conversation was over, Briggs was the part that would make it physical. Antonio didn't give them the satisfaction of panic. He didn't start pleading his innocence. He didn't reach for his wallet just to make it stop. He sat there like a man who knew exactly what their pressure was trying to pull out of him. And then he did something that made Keller visibly more irritated. Antonio stayed calm and focused on food like the conversation wasn't even about him being forced out of a diner. He looked at the menu like he was still choosing between breakfast and lunch, like he'd just remembered something sounded good. He named options in that easy, almost absent way: avocado toast, beef stroganoff, grilled salmon, like he was narrating his own thought process. To Keller, it felt like disrespect. But it wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was worse than that. It was Antonio refusing to be emotionally controlled. Keller leaned harder into the narrative. He claimed Antonio was pissing off the people. He claimed Antonio wasn't ordering. He claimed Antonio needed to scoot on down the road. He talked like he owned the space, like his job wasn't to enforce laws, but to enforce comfort. Antonio's response stayed the same. Calm, polite, short. He understood. He still wasn't giving them his ID. Keller's eyes narrowed like he was running out of socially acceptable ways to keep pushing. He circled back to the threat again. Identification was happening either way. If Antonio wouldn't cooperate, they'd do it for him. Keller implied cuffs. Keller implied downtown. Keller implied time, humiliation, paperwork, inconvenience, punishment for not submitting. Antonio didn't rise to it, and because Antonio didn't rise to it, Keller had to decide whether to walk away empty-handed or prove he could win. That's when Keller snapped. His tone changed in a way that didn't need translation. He stopped acting like this was optional. He directed Briggs to cuff him. Antonio's body moved before his face did. He slid out of the booth, not in a sudden way, but like someone trying to remove the excuse. He stood up, angled his shoulders away from them, and signaled he was leaving. His whole posture said, "Fine. You want me gone? I'm gone." No fight. No scene. It should have ended right there. But Keller and Briggs weren't looking for an ending. They were looking for control. Briggs reached for Antonio anyway. It happened fast, but not chaotic. Briggs grabbed him and pinned the moment in place. Antonio didn't swing. Antonio didn't lunge. He didn't give them the resisting clip they loved to write later. His hands stayed visible, his face stayed calm. But Briggs held him like the decision had already been made. And immediately, almost automatically, Briggs started searching. Not a careful pat-down for safety. Not a clear explanation. Just hands moving to pockets with a purpose. Briggs checked one side, then the other, then went straight to a front pocket like he already knew where to look. And there it was. Briggs pulled out Antonio's ID. Keller's entire energy shifted the second the card was in view. He stopped talking like Antonio was an anonymous nuisance and started talking like Antonio was now a known quantity. Keller watched Briggs confirm the name, watched the little administrative victory land, and you could feel the satisfaction in the way Keller's shoulders settled. They got what they wanted. They proved they could. But that victory only lasted a breath. Because Antonio's expression changed, not into fear, not into anger, but into something colder. Like a person watching someone else step onto a trap they didn't even see. Antonio looked at Keller and Briggs the way you look at someone who just bragged about breaking something, not realizing it was expensive and very well documented. Antonio didn't have to raise his voice to flip the dynamic. He just let a few words land with precision. He implied he wasn't there as some random guy hanging out. He implied he was federal. He implied he was working something that required anonymity. And forcing him to identify himself, forcing him to be exposed in a public place, had just ruined an operation that wasn't theirs to touch. Then Antonio added the detail that made Keller's jaw tighten in a way he couldn't hide. The whole encounter was recorded, not a maybe, not a threat, a statement. And when Antonio said that, Keller's face did something officers hated doing in public. It hesitated, just a flicker. But it was there. The calculation started, the mental rewind, the question that always came too late. Who else is going to see this? Briggs's grip loosened slightly, not out of kindness, but out of uncertainty. Keller didn't step back, but his authority suddenly felt less solid, like it was balancing on paperwork instead of ego. Antonio didn't press them with insults. He didn't gloat. He did something more effective. He started asking for documentation. He demanded their identifying information, names, badge numbers, whatever official ID system their department used. He asked how to obtain the incident report. He asked how to request the Bodycam footage. He asked it like a checklist, like he'd done this before, like he knew exactly what gets ignored and what can't be ignored once it's in writing. And for the first time since they walked up to his booth, Keller and Briggs weren't steering the moment anymore. They were reacting to it. Keller and Briggs didn't suddenly become nicer. They became careful. That was the difference. A minute earlier, Keller had been comfortable talking like the diner belonged to him, like community peace was a law he could enforce on command. Now, with Antonio calmly asking for identifiers and paperwork, Keller's posture shifted into damage control. Briggs, who had been all hands and pressure, started moving like every motion might be replayed later. Antonio didn't chase an apology. He didn't bargain. He stayed focused on the part officers hated most, the official trail. He repeated his requests, steady and precise. Their names, their badge numbers or department IDs, the process for getting the incident report, the correct way to request Bodycam footage, the contact information for the supervisor on duty, the details that turned a he said, she said into a case file. Keller tried to reframe the moment as routine. He tried to make it sound like this was normal community policing. But Antonio didn't accept the reframe. He kept the spotlight on the sequence, a call about a man sitting too long, a demand for ID without any clear crime, a threat of forced identification, then physical grabbing and a pocket search to get what they wanted. And the whole time, Antonio kept his voice even. No theater, no shouting, no "you're racist" speech to give them something to dismiss. Just the facts of what happened. That restraint mattered. Because in these situations, officers often survive not by being right, but by getting the other person to look unstable. Antonio didn't give them that. He asked one more thing that sealed it. He made it clear this wasn't going to stay in the diner. He indicated he had the encounter recorded. He implied his work required discretion. He implied their forced identification had interfered with something bigger than their shift schedule. He didn't need to over-explain. The uncertainty did the work for him. Keller couldn't tell if Antonio was bluffing, and that ambiguity made every decision Keller had made feel riskier. The officers eventually separated from him, not because they suddenly respected his rights, but because they could sense the ground changing under their feet. Keller and Briggs moved away with the tight, irritated energy of people who realized they'd pushed too far and now had to pretend they hadn't. Antonio didn't linger to trade words. He did what people who understand accountability do. He secured the details, left, and immediately started building the paper trail while everything was fresh. Over the next day, Antonio filed formal complaints through the channels that couldn't be shrugged off. He documented the time, the location, the behavior, the escalation, and the search. He requested the incident report and the body cam footage through the proper process. He also made sure the recording he had didn't just live on a phone. It went to the places that knew how to apply pressure, oversight, internal review, and the right legal contacts. And once the complaint existed on paper, it became harder for the department to pretend it was just a misunderstanding, because now they had to answer very specific questions. Why were officers dispatched to a diner over someone sitting too long in the first place? What exactly was the suspicion? What law did Antonio break by sitting quietly? What justified the demand for identification? What justified detaining him when he stood to leave? What justified searching his pockets for ID? The department could have tried to bury it if it was only his word. But it wasn't. The diner had its own cameras. The officers had their own body cams, and Antonio's recording captured the tone shift, the threats, and the moment physical control replaced conversation. That's the part people miss about these encounters. The moment an officer decides to win is usually the moment the evidence starts piling up against them. In the short term, the story moved through the community fast, not as a rumor, more like a warning. Diners and barbershops and group chats lit up with the same pattern people had seen before. Someone minding their business, officers creating a problem, then acting like the person caused it by not submitting. But this time, there was a difference. There was clean documentation. As the complaint circulated through the right channels, supervisors had to review footage, compare statements, and line up the timeline. And once the facts were pinned down, the department couldn't credibly defend Keller's framing that Antonio was a community issue. It looked like what it was, an escalation built on discomfort, not law. The internal review didn't need dramatic conclusions. It just needed to be honest about procedure. The outcome hit weeks later, the way these things usually do, quietly, officially, with formal language that still carried a loud message. Both officers were fired. Not suspended, not retrained, not moved to a different shift. Fired. And when people asked why, the answer wasn't complicated. They had used vague complaints as a reason to harass. They had threatened consequences for refusing a demand. They had detained and searched to force identification. And they had done it in a public place, over a man calmly sitting in a booth. Antonio didn't celebrate in public. He didn't tour the internet for attention. He treated it the way he treated the whole encounter, like a matter of record. But the ripple mattered. The diner staff changed how they handled concern calls. The department adjusted guidance around non-criminal complaints and ID demands. Supervisors reminded officers that it felt suspicious, wasn't probable cause. And in that neighborhood diner, where comfort used to function like a gate, people learned that comfort doesn't outrank rights. Here's the part to sit with. Antonio didn't win because he got loud. He won because he stayed calm, refused to be baited, and demanded documentation like it was oxygen. So let me ask you, if you were sitting there and two officers tried to turn your presence into a problem, would you have stayed that composed? Or would their pressure have pulled you into the exact reaction they were hoping for? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever dealt with a situation like this, tell your story too. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs it. And subscribe for more story times where accountability shows up and dignity wins.